In the year 1587, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, an ambitious expedition set sail from England to the shores of the New World, carrying with it 115 settlers, men, women, and children, who dreamed of a fresh start on the rugged coast of what is now North Carolina, and their chosen destination was Roanoke Island, a patch of forested land surrounded by marshes and the restless Atlantic. And though the journey was fraught with storms and dwindling supplies, the promise of fertile soil, abundant game, and freedom from the tangled politics of England drove them onward. Yet from the moment their small ships approached the sandy beaches, a strange stillness settled over the land, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, and the air carried a faint, sweet, metallic scent, almost like blood after rain. John White, their appointed governor, noted the absence of visible native villagers. Though signs of recent habitation were there, ashes and fire pits, footprints along the shore, but no human voices to greet them, and the settlers, uneasy but determined, began erecting their wooden homes within a palisade, carving out a semblance of civilization against the wild. Yet the nights were not silent, for from the edge of the dark pine woods came whispers in a tongue none recognized, soft at first, like the sigh of wind through leaves, but sometimes sharp and guttural, almost animal. And though White tried to keep order, he himself could not ignore the occasional flicker of pale light weaving between the trunks at night, too tall and fluid to be torch-bearing men, too deliberate to be fireflies. As the weeks wore on, relations with nearby native tribes were strained, some friendly, some hostile, all wary of the settlers and food. Supplies dwindled until White, reluctantly, decided to return to England for aid, a journey that should have taken months but stretched into 3 long years due to the eruption of war with Spain. And when he finally returned in 1590, his heart sank at the sight before him. The fort stood abandoned, weathered by wind and salt, houses empty, tools scattered, but there were no bodies, no bones, only silence and that same faint metallic scent in the air. And carved deep into a wooden post was the word CROATOAN, while another nearby tree bore only the letter CRO. And though this was the agreed-upon sign that the colony might have moved to CROATOAN Island, there was no cross or distress mark carved alongside, which meant, by their plan, that the settlers had not been in danger when they left. Yet White found no trace of them on CROATOAN either, nor in any neighboring villages. And so the story passed into history as the Lost Colony, a mystery that baffled scholars and inspired endless speculation. But there are accounts, ones kept from the public, of other English expeditions in the years that followed, who found, deep in the forest beyond Roanoke, strange wooden totems etched with symbols unknown to any tribe, symbols resembling tangled roots or twisted antlers, always arranged in circles where the grass grew dead and brittle. And some spoke of hearing a low, resonant hum that made their teeth ache, while others claimed to glimpse figures at dusk, impossibly tall, thin, silhouettes with eyes that caught the light like a predator's, watching from between the trees. One journal, preserved in a private collection in London and attributed to a sailor named Thomas Harrow, describes entering a clearing where 7 human figures stood perfectly still, their skin mottled and dark as burnt leather, their mouths sewn shut with what looked like sinew, and in the center of them, a crude wooden effigy of a man with antlers made of bone, its hollow eye sockets fixed on the intruders. And as they approached, the standing figures slowly turned their heads in unison, the sound of tearing flesh accompanying the movement. And Harrow fled, swearing never to return, yet for the rest of his voyage he claimed to hear, in the creak of the ship's timbers, the muffled chant of a word he could not understand. Another account, from a native elder of the Croatoan people, tells of a time before the English came, when a shadow beast dwelled in the pines, feeding on those who wandered too far from the firelight, and that a desperate shaman once bound it beneath the earth using a ritual that required both blood and bone, warning that if the seal were ever broken, the creature would reclaim the land. And perhaps, he said, the pale-skinned settlers broke the seal without knowing. In the centuries since, hunters and hikers have vanished near Roanoke, and those few who returned spoke of waking in the night to find themselves lying on cold earth, unable to move, while a gaunt face with antlers loomed above them, whispering in a voice like wind through dead leaves, and a feeling of pressure on their chest as though roots were growing into them. To this day, the island is avoided after dusk, and though historians write of famine, disease, or assimilation as the settlers' fate, the locals know better, for on some nights, if the wind is right, you can hear the sewing of thread through flesh, and if you follow it into the trees, you might find the lost colony, still there, standing in silence, waiting for the seal to break again. And though the official record grew quiet after John White's failed search, the land itself seemed unwilling to let the story fade. For in 1603, a group of English traders bound for the Chesapeake reported anchoring near Roanoke to gather fresh water. But upon entering the tree line, they stumbled upon a weathered structure unlike any native dwelling they had seen. A narrow, circular hut built entirely from stripped pine trunks bound with sinew, its roof sagging under moss, and within, the floor was covered in human jawbones arranged in spirals, some small as a child's, others massive and yellowed with age, and at the center sat a wooden mask carved in the likeness of a man's face, though its proportions were stretched and alien, with a long slit for a mouth and deep eye hollows filled with what looked like blackened beeswax. The traders, horrified, retreated, but one man, Francis Llewellyn, slipped the mask into his pack, thinking it a valuable artifact, and according to his shipmates, that was when the forest began to change, the trees seeming to lean inward, their branches tangling like hands reaching down, the daylight dimming unnaturally fast, and by nightfall, Francis had grown pale and feverish, whispering the same word over and over, CROATOAN, until his voice failed, and when the crew awoke the next morning, his bunk was empty, the mask gone, and along the sand where their boat had been pulled up were prints, not of feet, but of cloven hooves, leading back into the trees. Decades later, in 1672, a Jesuit missionary named Father Guillaume W. kept a diary while traveling through the Outer Banks, describing the conversion of small Algonquian villages, but one entry stands out. He tells of being invited to a midnight gathering by elders who wished to show him the truth of the pale ghosts, leading him through marsh and thicket until they reached a grove where every tree bore the same carved antler symbol, and in the middle lay a pool of stagnant water that reflected the moonlight like glass. Yet the moon above was obscured by clouds, meaning the light came from below, and as Guillaume leaned closer, he saw faces beneath the water, dozens of them, mouths moving silently, eyes wide and unblinking, some faces pale like Englishmen, others bearing the paint and braids of native warriors, all drifting slowly in the dark, and the elder whispered, "They are neither dead nor alive, Father, for the forest remembers and keeps what it is owed." Guillaume fled that night and returned to France within a year, never again speaking of the New World. In 1738, an entire fishing village on the mainland vanished in a single stormless night, leaving behind only boiling kettles of stew, drying nets, and footprints that led inland to Roanoke before simply stopping as if the owners had been lifted into the air. By the 1800s, the legend of the lost colony was fodder for sailors' tavern tales, but a handful of scholars believed there was more, and in 1821, Professor Elias Morton of Boston University funded an expedition to dig on Roanoke Island, claiming he had decoded a cipher in John White's original maps that pointed to a burial of the seal, and though his men unearthed nothing but soil and roots for days, on the seventh night, one laborer uncovered a stone slab etched with the same intertwined antler symbols, slick to the touch despite the dry air, and the next morning, Morton's entire camp was deserted, save for the slab, which now bore fresh carvings, 115 tally marks, and a crude depiction of ships sailing away under a crescent moon. By the time the slab's discovery had been quietly erased from Boston's academic records, whispers of Roanoke's curse began to circulate among Confederate and Union soldiers during the American Civil War, for in 1862, a detachment of Union scouts sent to secure the Outer Banks returned with only half their number, the survivors pale and glassy-eyed, their boots caked with black mud despite dry weather. speaking in halting, unfamiliar syllables that no interpreter could place, and each man bore on his skin a pattern of raised welts shaped like branching antlers that spread over the weeks until they turned septic and killed them. One officer, in his final delirium, claimed that in the pines he had seen a procession of figures, colonists in tattered Elizabethan garb, skin tight and dry like parchment, mouths moving without sound, led by something taller than any man, draped in shadow but crowned with antlers of bone, its hands long enough to brush the ground, its eyes burning with a steady red light. After the war, locals avoided the island entirely. Yet sailors spoke of nights when a low mist would roll off Roanoke and drift over the water, carrying with it the smell of brine and iron and a faint chorus of voices chanting in time with the tide. And if one listened too long, they would find themselves walking toward the shore without knowing why. In 1901, an amateur folklorist named Margaret Ellison visited Roanoke to record oral histories from the descendants of CROATOAN elders, and among the brittle, half-forgotten stories she captured on wax cylinders was one that chilled her beyond reason, a woman's trembling voice describing how, as a girl, she had followed her father into the woods to hunt deer and stumbled upon a ring of stones each painted white, with small bundles of herbs and bones tied together and placed at the center, and from the shadows beyond the ring came the sound of a baby crying, though the closer they moved toward it, the further away it seemed, until her father, face drained of color, grabbed her and ran without looking back, saying only, "That's how they call you in, so they can make you stay." Decades later, in 1937, during the height of the Great Depression, a group of workmen clearing land on the mainland unearthed a weathered stone slab bearing an inscription that claimed to be the final words of Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, detailing how half the colony had died from sickness of the soul, while the others walked willingly into the dark trees, following the crowned shadow. But while the first stone is considered genuine by some, dozens of other so-called Dare stones appeared soon after, widely dismissed as hoaxes. And yet those who handled the first stone often reported strange dreams of standing on a beach under a sky with two moons, hearing the sound of sewing through flesh and the muffled weeping of unseen women. By the late 20th century, most academics had relegated Roanoke's mystery to unsolved history. But in 1989, a team of paranormal investigators led by Dr. Henry Alcott camped on the island to record EVP, electronic voice phenomena, and their final tapes, recovered from the site after they vanished, captured more than static. There were rhythmic thumps like footsteps circling the microphones, and a woman's voice, faint but clear, repeating, "The door is open, the door is open, the door is open," followed by a long, tearing sound and the sudden crash of equipment. The last minute of the tape contained nothing but a low, resonant hum that analysts later claimed matched the frequency of certain prehistoric cave instruments, and then a deep male voice, not of anyone on the team, whispered 115, and the recording ended. And by the early years of the 21st century, Roanoke had become little more than a tourist curiosity by day, with gift shops selling trinkets engraved with CROATOAN and guides leading casual strolls to the reconstructed fort. But the locals knew better than to linger after dark, for it was then, when the sun bled out into the Atlantic and the pines cast their longest shadows, that the island's true face emerged. In 2007, a small documentary crew from Raleigh arrived with the aim of filming a Halloween special on the Lost Colony, bringing with them high-definition cameras, infrared night vision, and enough backup power to last a week. Yet the footage they captured, smuggled out by an editor before the production company sealed the rest, shows a slow unraveling over just 3 nights. On the first, laughter and casual interviews by the shore, the hiss of wind and microphones, but as dusk fell, the air thickened and the crew began reporting static in their headsets and the sensation of being watched. The second night's raw footage is shakier, the camera panning wildly as the sound of distant sewing, thread being pulled through something wet, grows louder, and in the infrared you can just make out figures between the trees, unmoving, too tall to be human, their limbs jointed wrong. By the third night, the footage becomes nearly incoherent, shouts, the crash of gear, and a single voice screaming, "It's not gone, it's never gone," before the screen goes black and the audio continues for 23 minutes, filled with a low chant and the occasional muffled sob. When authorities arrived on day 4, the camp was empty, equipment abandoned, tents shredded as if cut by something sharp yet uneven, and on one tent flap the word "return" had been burned into the fabric. The recovered hard drives were locked away, but a whistleblower later revealed that the final file contained a panoramic shot of the beach at sunrise. The camera slowly panning inland to reveal over 100 figures standing just inside the tree line, all facing the lens, all still, their eyes reflecting the light like animals, and at their head, the crowned shadow, antlers white as bone, cloak shifting like smoke, raising one long hand as if in greeting. After that, no official expedition has been sanctioned, and even the most daring urban explorers speak of the island with unease, claiming that GPS devices fail within a mile of its shore, and that cell signals are replaced with faint, breathy whispers in an unknown tongue. Still, every few years someone goes missing in the waters around Roanoke, and the Coast Guard's reports always note the same strange detail. The abandoned boats are found drifting with their anchors still raised, their decks scattered with small bundles of herbs and bones bound with sinew, each one containing a single tooth, and though historians will tell you the lost colony vanished into assimilation or famine, the truth, spoken only in hushed tones among the oldest families of the Outer Banks, is that they never left at all, that they're still there, in the forest, kept by something older than the island itself, something bound by blood and bone and shadow, waiting for the seal to break. And if you're ever foolish enough to walk the pines at night and hear your name called in a voice you know, do not answer, for the moment you step toward it, you too will stand among them, eyes fixed on the next traveler, your mouth moving without sound, forever part of the colony that was lost, but never gone. And in the years following the vanished documentary crew, the island seemed to recede into silence, as if sated for the moment. But for those who live along the Carolina coast, the signs remained. The sudden fog that rolled in on clear days, the way gulls would wheel in frantic circles over the same patch of water before scattering inland, and the unshakable smell of brine and copper that lingered after storms. In 2013, a retired Coast Guard officer named Daniel Keats began writing a private blog about his decades of service near the Outer Banks, detailing strange rescues and impossible sightings, and among his final entries was one describing a call in 1997 to investigate a flare sighting just off Roanoke. When they arrived, they found not a distress vessel, but an old wooden pinnace, the kind used in the late 1500s, drifting without sails, its hull crusted with barnacles and carved with the name Lion's Wake in faded paint. Climbing aboard, Keats found the deck covered in footprints pressed deep into the wood as though the planks themselves had softened under weight, and the captain's cabin locked from the inside. When forced open, it revealed a single wooden chair facing a mirror, but the reflection did not match the room. In the mirror, the window behind the chair showed not the gray Atlantic, but a dense pine forest swaying without wind, and in the glass stood dozens of figures in Elizabethan dress, their faces blurred, except for one woman at the center pale and severe, lips moving as if in warning. Keats swore that as he leaned closer, the woman's head turned sharply toward him, her mouth stretching wider than humanly possible, and the mirror shattered in his hands. They towed the pinnace back to shore, but by morning it had vanished from the marina without a trace. Around the same time, researchers at a small coastal museum cataloged an artifact donated anonymously, a tattered, salt-stiffened journal written in archaic English, with entries dated 1588 to 1589, but scattered between them were passages in an unrecognizable script of looping, antler-like shapes, and the final page contained only a drawing of a ring of stones with a black pool at the center, and beneath it, the word "seal is kept, not broken. When broken, we walk again." Linguists failed to identify the strange script, but when a copy was shown to a CROATOAN elder in secret, he reportedly grew pale, refused to speak, and demanded the paper be burned, saying only, "Those shapes are not meant to be seen. The elder died within a week, his body found in his home, surrounded by a perfect ring of seawater, though the nearest shore was over a mile away. By 2018, the island had quietly been closed to overnight visitors, though no official statement was made, and yet drone footage began surfacing online showing things the tourism board dismissed as optical artifacts. Antler-shaped clearings appearing in the marsh, stones arranged in spirals too. Precise to be accidental, and at the heart of one clearing, a dark stain that seemed to swallow light. Those who tried to investigate, amateur ghost hunters, thrill seekers, often posted a few videos before going silent, their accounts deleted, their equipment later found in pawn shops hundreds of miles away. The locals, when pressed, tell a different story. That the colony's disappearance was never about starvation or hostile tribes, but about a pact, a bargain struck between desperate settlers, and something that had always lived in the shadow of the pines, something that promised survival in exchange for belonging, and belonging meant becoming part of it forever. They say the seal that holds it is weakening, worn thin by centuries, and that each disappearance feeds its strength. They say the crown's shadow walks more often now, closer to the shore, and that when the seal finally breaks, it will not be just Roanoke that is emptied, but every shore that hears the Atlantic's tide. And in the winter of 2021, when tourism was still slow from the lingering pandemic, a private research group calling themselves the Meridian Institute quietly obtained permits to study Roanoke under the guise of environmental mapping, bringing with them an array of LiDAR scanners, ground-penetrating radar, and a small AI system programmed to detect unnatural geometric patterns and soil displacement. Their public updates spoke only of coastal erosion and wildlife habitats, but an anonymous technician later leaked a portion of the AI's flagged imagery. Among the usual root networks and buried shells were formations that seemed almost architectural, perfect concentric rings deep beneath the forest floor, with radial corridors leading to a central void nearly 60 feet wide, and in the core of that void, a singular vertical shape, dense and metallic, its profile disturbingly like a column crowned with branching antlers. The Institute abruptly pulled their team off the island, citing logistical issues, but internal memos hinted at rising paranoia among the staff, sleepwalking, sudden violent outbursts, and a pervasive sound in the camp at night like breathing from inside the trees. One field log described a team member waking to find small bundles of herbs and bones arranged around their tent in a perfect spiral, and another wrote of a figure glimpsed at dawn, standing ankle-deep in the surf, its antlers stretching unnaturally toward the clouds, the sky behind it roiling. With clouds though the rest of the horizon was clear, by spring, local fishermen began reporting nets tangled with hair. Not seaweed, not rope, but human hair, some strands brittle and gray, others long and black, all woven with fragments of seashells. In June, a kayaker paddling near the island claimed to hear singing beneath the water, a woman's voice in an old dialect of English, promising safe passage if you come ashore and join hands. And he fled, but for weeks afterward dreamed of standing in a pine forest ringed by stones, feeling something press gently against the back of his neck, warm and damp. Meanwhile, in an archive basement at the University of Virginia, a graduate student reviewing neglected colonial correspondence found a letter never cataloged, written in John White's own hand but addressed to no one. In it, he admits that the colony did not starve, that they came in the night, wearing the faces of those already dead, that the settlers followed willingly into the trees after the crowned one spoke in their mother's tongue, and that he alone was left because I would not look upon its face. He ends the letter with a single warning: it waits still. The seal will not hold forever. The student who found the letter disappeared 2 days later, last seen boarding a bus to the Outer Banks. Her laptop was found in her apartment, still open to a file where she had been translating the looping antler-like script into phonetic English, though the translation ends mid-sentence after the words, when the tide is highest and the moon is now, as the summer of 2025 approaches. Satellite images showed changes on the island too subtle for news reports, but undeniable to those who study them. The shadows of the pines fall in patterns that match the antler shapes of the script, and the shoreline itself seems to curve inward unnaturally, as though the land is folding around something at its center, guarding it, or holding it in. The elders say the night it breaks will be the night the voices stop calling names and start calling numbers, and when they count high enough, there will be no one left to answer. And by late autumn of 2025, the seal, spoken of only in whispers, was showing the first undeniable signs of weakening. It began with the tides, which no longer followed lunar patterns but instead surged in and out as though breathing, their rhythm matching the deep, almost imperceptible thrum one could feel through the soles of their feet when standing on the island shore. Scientists from coastal monitoring stations noted strange magnetic spikes coinciding with these tides, spikes strong, enough to wipe hard drives and scramble compasses, but the government reports explaining them were heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out save for the phrase pattern matches pre-contact anomaly. Fishermen started hauling in catches with strange markings. Fish whose scales bore looping antler-like scars, crabs missing eyes but alive, shells etched with spirals that matched the drawings in the Lost Colonial Journal. Then came the lights. Columns of pale blue radiance shooting up from the island's interior, visible for miles, pulsing in time with the tides and always followed by sudden, unnatural stillness in the air, as though the world was holding its breath. On October 31st, a storm formed offshore with alarming speed, yet moved nowhere, circling the island in perfect symmetry for 3 days, lightning illuminating the treeline in stark flashes that revealed dozens, no, hundreds, of unmoving silhouettes between the trunks, each flash freezing them in a new position, closer to the shore. During the second night of the storm, multiple 911 calls came from the mainland towns facing Roanoke, reporting voices at their windows calling names in perfect mimicry of dead relatives, some accompanied by rhythmic knocking that matched the thrum of the tides. The calls were dismissed publicly as hoaxes, but audio leaked from the dispatch center captures one such voice, low and almost tender, saying, "We have been waiting for you to come home." In the first week of November, the shoreline of Roanoke physically changed. Satellite images showed a perfect ring of white surf surrounding the island, and in the center of that ring, visible only in certain wavelengths, a massive shadow with branching antlers stretching far wider than any living creature could bear. Then, without warning, on the night of November 12th, the seal broke, not with an explosion, but with silence. The tide withdrew completely, leaving the seabed exposed for miles, littered with pale, human-shaped forms that twitched as though breathing. The crowned shadow stepped onto the bare sand, moving toward the mainland, each step leaving pools of dark water in its wake, and behind it came the colony, their eyes like mirrors, mouths moving in perfect unison, chanting in that looping, inhuman language. Those who saw it from the shore say the chant was not heard with the ears, but felt directly in the bones, vibrating the ribs, forcing hearts to match its rhythm. One last recording exists, taken by an unknown witness streaming live. Before the feed cut, grainy footage showing the crowned shadow raising a hand, the chant stopping, and every light on the mainland flickering out simultaneously. In the final frame before darkness, the colony turns to face the camera, and in the front row, a woman in Elizabethan dress raises her hand or lips, as if to shush the viewer, her eyes reflecting not light, but the silhouette of antlers. The feed ends there. And in the days that followed, Roanoke vanished from all official maps, the space where it should be now labeled as restricted waters. No one speaks of the colony anymore, but sometimes on windless nights along the Carolina coast, the tide retreats farther than it should, and if you stand there long enough, you might see figures in the distance, standing ankle-deep in the surf, waiting, not moving, not speaking, until you blink, and they are suddenly closer, their mirrored eyes fixed on you, their mouths shaping the words, "Welcome home."